All right, so we're going to finish up our discussion of period 6 with the last key concept for our entire class. So we've come to the end of a long, hard road. But the 20th century witnesses a great deal of warfare and the collapse of the global economy in the 1930s. In response to these challenges, the role of the state in the domestic economy fluctuated. New institutions of global governance emerged and continued to develop throughout the century. Scientific breakthroughs, new technologies, increasing levels of integration, changing relationships between humans and the environment, and the frequency of political conflicts are all going to contribute to global developments in which people are crafting new understandings of society, culture, and historical interpretations. Institutions of global governance both shaped and adapted to these social conditions. So first, we're going to look at state responses to the economic challenges of the 20th century. Obviously, we've seen, we've talked a little bit about the Great Depression. And in communist states, the Soviet Union and China, the communist governments that take control are going to have very tight control of their economies. In the Soviet Union and in beginning in China, you have a series of 5-year plans that help those nations industrialize. Of course, Mao tries to attempt a great leap forward in the 1950s, which is a unmitigated disaster, results in the famine of the death of millions of people through famine. So at the beginning of the 20th century in the U.S. and parts of Europe, governments did play a minimum role in their economies. But the Great Depression is going to change that process, and they're going to take more active roles. You have the New Deal, obviously, in the United States, which is an answer to the Great Depression, and the rise of fascist corporatist economies in Italy and Germany. So these are both direct reactions to the challenges of the Great Depression. In newly independent states after World War II, governments often take a strong role in guiding their economic life to promote development as well. Specifically, you see this in Gamal Abdel Nasser's promotion of economic development in Egypt, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, the building of various dam projects along the Nile River. And in the Asian tigers, you have Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, Japan. You have these different Asian countries and city-states that build powerful economies, much of them on export-oriented economies. After the end of the Cold War, pretty much free market capitalism was the only game in town, and you see basically the United States and Great Britain specifically really kind of double down on these ideas of free market principles. Reagan with trickle-down economics, and then Thatcher with the conservatism of Great Britain. Similarly, even in China, even though it's still a communist nation, Deng Xiaoping is going to create market reforms that are going to allow for more economic growth in China as well. And in Chile, you have Augusto Pinochet, who's a brutal dictator, but is widely supported because of his anti-communist movements. So as we see this, as we see after World War II, we see nations begin to come back around to the idea of fostering peace and cooperation. We saw the League of Nations after World War I failed largely because of the absence of the United States, and also just an inability or unwillingness to enforce its rules. But after World War II, a much more effective version, the United Nations, is developed and still operates today. Also, the International Criminal Court is established to try war criminals or other people who commit atrocities against humanity. This is it's sometimes controversial, but it exists nonetheless. We also see changing economic institutions during this period. You have the International Monetary Fund, which is created to help facilitate the trading of currencies and kind of regulate global currency, so you don't have these huge swings and spikes in inflation like you had after World War I. The World Bank exists to make loans and provide aid for countries to help economic development. World Trade Organization exists to help regulate international trade. And of course, you have the rise of the multinational corporation, your Nikes, your GM, your Ford, all of these different corporations that operate in different countries and often wield a lot of power in the countries in which they operate. Of course, this has been accompanied by regional trade agreements. You had the founding of the European Economic Community in the 1950s, which is created to help European nations cooperate and therefore better compete with the United States and later on China and some of the Asian tigers. The European Economic Community lowers trade barriers and tariffs between European nations, and it is kind of the forerunner of the modern European Union, which may be in some trouble now. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, lowers trade barriers between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And another example is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a trade association similar to the European Economic Community, but just between the nations of Southeast Asia. Movements through the world also protested the inequality of environmental and economic consequences of global integration. You see this especially in the environmentalist movement, the organization of Greenpeace, as well as the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, and the development of the global celebration of Earth Day. We also see people conceptualizing society and culture in new ways. You see rights-based discourse challenge old assumptions about race, class, and gender and religion. So in much of the New World, access to education as well as participation in political and professional arenas become more inclusive in terms of race, class, and gender. These challenges include the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the global feminist movement, the Negritude movement, liberation theology, which holds that God, basically is on the side of the poor and the downtrodden, and this pushing of social justice reforms. And you also have the Islamic renewal movement. Now, all of these things work to create more access to education and political and professional roles. You see the women's suffrage movement gains women's right to vote in almost all countries in the world. You have a rising rate of female literacy and increased numbers of women in higher education. In fact, more women go to schools than go to college than any other than men do. So that has completely flipped around in the last several decades. Of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 68, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the end of apartheid in South Africa, and of course the caste and reservation in Indian Constitution of 1949 effectively ends the legal support for the caste system in India. So you even during this period see the globalization of popular consumer culture. Reggae music expands the globe. You have the advent of Bollywood music or Bollywood movies and cinema in India that become a global phenomenon. And if you've seen Slumdog Millionaire, it's a popular movie here in the United States, and it had a big Bollywood scene at the ending with the intricate dance numbers. World Cup soccer is a global phenomenon. And, of course, the Olympics are an example of this globalization of popular consumer culture. So it's going to wrap us up. That's your last video for the entire year. So congratulations and good luck on the AP final, or AP exam, I should say. Bye.